So good morning. Thanks you all for showing up. I really appreciate it. Like I said, I thought it might just be me talking to myself, so it's good to have you guys here. Oh yeah, well, or talking to Keith's camera. So I appreciate you guys coming out. My name is John Boucher. I'm just one of the volunteer docents here on the ship. And a while ago, Russell Moore said he wanted to do a presentation relating to the invasion of Okinawa, and I thought, well, I've been curious about finding out a little bit more about this mission, and so I said I would take this on and do some research. So this week is the 80th anniversary of the invasion of Okinawa, and the actual invasion took place on April 1st, 1945, and it was a long 82-day campaign from the initial invasion until they kind of declared the main hostilities to be done. Although really there was preparatory bombing weeks before, and fighting went on up till the end of the war and even a little after. So, but what I want to talk about today is just one day out of that 82-day mission, essentially that 82-day invasion. It was a day that involved a mission that was pretty historic, pretty tragic really, and for this ship, very significant in the history of this ship. So that's why I think it's important. So when you come on the ship and you look kind of up and to the right, above the bomb elevator on the hangar deck, you'll see the ship's scoreboard. And that's kind of its record during World War II. And in the bottom left corner, you see this, Yamato. And a lot of times people will ask, well, what's that all about? Because it's probably the biggest thing on there. And they'll also, or they may know about this ship, but really not know the whole story about it. So that's kind of what I want to do this morning, is talk a little backstory about this ship, its significance, a little bit of its history, and then talk about when it met up with the aviators from the Hornet, as well as a whole host of other carriers, which is actually on April 7th, 1945. So to talk about the history of this ship, really the backstory, we have to kind of go back prior to World War I. In the late 19th and early 20th century, there was an incredible advancement in the technology of warships. And in the run-up to World War I and during World War I, there was an incredible arms race to develop new, larger, more powerful, primarily battleships and battle cruisers to control the seas. And England and Germany were really the main ones involved in that, because they were the main belligerents, but it also involved pretty much every navy in the world: US, Japan, Russia, Turkey, Italy, France, even places like Argentina, Brazil. And so it was, per GDP, it was one of the largest arms race in the history of the world. And after World War I, everybody was just set to keep going. Everybody had plans for newer ships, bigger ships, and eventually the politicians kind of stepped in and they kind of said, we need to do a timeout here. So they started a number of naval treaties. The first and probably the most significant was this Washington Naval Treaty in 1922. And it set a whole bunch of limits. During this time, aircraft carriers really weren't a thing. Battleships, battle cruisers were really the primary naval arm. So that sort of became the main focus. And these treaties did a whole bunch of things. For example, they limited the size of battleships to 35,000 tons. They limited the caliber of guns to 16-inch. They had a 10-year limit where they said nobody could build any battleships for 10 years, with a few exceptions. And then a big thing kind of relating to this story is it set a total cap on the total amount of tonnage that the different countries could build. And it came out to what they kind of call a 5-to-5-to-3 ratio between the US, the British, and the Japanese. So the US and British could build 525,000 tons total. Japan could have a total of 315,000 tons. And then in that ratio, France and Italy were like 1.75, so they were a little less. So what this essentially did is, for the Japanese, is it capped them at 60% of the total tonnage that the U.S. Navy could have. So it really kind of set them at a disadvantage. And then the Japanese also knew if this treaty system eventually broke down, there was no way they were going to be able to keep up with the production of the U.S. So they were going to kind of be at a disadvantage. And they had done a bunch of wargaming looking at what they needed, what they felt they needed to defeat the U.S. Navy, because that was sort of their main focus during this time in the 30s. And time again, they kind of came up with needing 70% of the power of the U.S. Navy to have a chance to come out ahead. And being capped at 60%, they probably weren't going to make it. So kind of what they decided is, we're never going to be able to keep up with the U.S. quantitatively, so the only way we can sort of make up that difference is by having a qualitative advantage, by building the most powerful ships that anybody has built. So that's sort of where the history of this ship, the Yamato, came from, is this idea that we're going to build the largest, most powerful battleship any nation's ever seen, that's going to be able to go up against possibly multiple U.S. battleships to make up that difference. So, like all the nations during the 20s to the early 30s, there was tons and tons of plans. Nobody could really build battleships, so everybody was just doing plans, revisions upon revisions. 1935, the Japanese dropped out of the naval treaty system, and so they decided, okay, we're going to build these ships, and we're going to make them as powerful as we can. So unlike what everybody had sort of previously been doing, which was, let's make the best battleship we can while being under 35,000 tons, they said, we're going to build in the capability that we need to overmatch any U.S. ship, and whatever the tonnage comes out to, that's what it's going to come out to. So partly what they were going to do, partly one of the things that they did, is they built incredible secrecy when they built these ships around the dock graving yards where they were building the ships, but huge bamboo fences around them so nobody could see. All the plans kept secure. Every night when guys got done working, all the blueprints went back into a lock and key. Workers were all threatened with potential execution if they let anybody know the capabilities of these. So what that really ended up is, the U.S. didn't know really the true characteristics of these ships till after the war. So one of the things they did also is they knew the ship was going to be more powerful than anything that was able to be built under the naval treaty system. But the other thing they did is they knew that the U.S. Navy, number one, they would probably keep 16-inch guns, because that's what the U.S. Navy had been building for quite a while. And they also figured that the U.S. Navy would build any of their ships to be able to fit through the Panama Canal, because it was really important to be able to shift from Atlantic to Pacific in a relatively quick time period. So they actually did 5 different studies looking at what's the biggest ship that could still fit through the Panama Canal. And it turned out those studies were within just a few % of what the Iowa-class battleships ended up being. So they knew based on that, this is probably the biggest ship the U.S. can build. So what do we have to build to make something to give us an overmatch on that? And that's where this design came from. So they really started designing this ship in about 1935, started building it in about 1937. So some of the design features, number one, 18-inch guns was, they decided early on, we're going to build in 18-inch guns, which was the most powerful gun ever put on any warship. significantly larger than the US 16-inch guns. The turret configuration, kind of like you see here, is similar to US battleships. 3 triple turrets, 2 towards the bow, 1 towards the stern, but really large. If you look at these pictures, this is the turret from the British battleship Hood, this is the Bismarck, and this is the Yamato. So, huge turret. Significantly larger shells, range of 26 miles, so very long range. So I don't know who this girl is. It was just a picture I found on the internet that gives you an idea of the relative size of these shells, but very large. So you can kind of see US 16-inch shell, like on the Iowa class, 2,700 pounds. These were 3,200 pounds, so significantly larger. Similar, like the US battleships, with 6 propellant charge bags. A little bit larger. US ones were about 110 pounds per sack of powder. These were about a little over 120 pounds, so about 10 pounds more. Overall, about 60 pounds more of propellant to fire these shells. Like everybody else, they had armor-piercing shells. They had high explosive shells. And then the one thing that was unique, Japanese were the only ones that had that. In fact, these ships were the only ones that had this. They actually had an anti-aircraft shell for their main guns. It was this Type 3 Sanshiki shell that inside the shell there was 900 submunitions that carried phosphorus and magnesium. And so the shell would fire off. There's actually a picture of one taken from a US aircraft. It would explode, and then these 900 incendiary submunitions would fly out, and the idea it would hit an aircraft or a whole group of aircraft, set them on fire and knock them down. Spoiler alert, it didn't really work, but it sounded cool. But trying to track an aircraft with this giant turret didn't really work so well, but sounded cool. So one of the things about these guns, they determined, I don't know if this really worked out in reality, but they did a bunch of experiments on the blast effect of what's going to happen if you're on the ship when these guns fire. And they figured that if you were within 45 feet of one of the turrets firing all 3 guns, you could be knocked unconscious if you're exposed out on the deck. So they designed this ship. It was a pretty amazing design where essentially in its initial configuration, everything was enclosed. So you can see, like US battleships, normally they would have catapults just like this on the stern, and they would have aircraft float planes that would be on those catapults, and they would just sit there all the time. If it was going into battle, usually they would just fly them off so they would be out of there. For this ship, they actually designed a hangar. It could hold 5 aircraft. They would lower them down in, close it up, so they were fully enclosed. And then also the ship's boats were also kept inside. It was like a boat dock. You can kind of see it here on both sides. They would open this door and the ship's boats would slide out on this track, and then they could be lowered in the water. So again, they wouldn't be destroyed when the main guns fired. And then also a lot of the anti-aircraft guns, initially, they were all fully enclosed. So even the kind of smaller caliber guns were enclosed to give the guys a little protection from enemy fire, but also to, again, protect them from that blast effect. So secondary guns, they had these triple 6.1-inch turrets. Initially, there was 4 of them, one forward of the superstructure, 1 aft, and then 2 on the wings. Later on, they removed these wing turrets and added a whole bunch more anti-aircraft guns. Just like everybody during World War II, they kept just adding more and more anti-aircraft guns. So these were single-purpose anti-surface turrets only. So in terms of this battle we're talking about today, really didn't take any part. But the anti-aircraft guns, there was considerable. So you can kind of see going from this in its initial configuration to this in its final configuration, lots of anti-aircraft guns. So its larger caliber anti-aircraft guns were 5-inch, kind of like on all the US ships. I think they're a little bit larger, 5-inch 40 caliber versus 5-inch 38 caliber on the US ships. Initially, they were kind of all enclosed like this. Later on, they had a number of open mount ones as well. Pretty effective guns. The only downside in comparison to the US ships, they didn't have the variable timed or proximity fuse. So for anti-aircraft, not nearly as effective as the US ones, primarily because of the fusing that the US guns had. And then their smaller caliber guns were these 25 millimeter rapid fire cannons. I've heard them called the worst anti-aircraft gun in World War II. The caliber was not, it was smaller than like a 40 millimeter Bofors that the US had. But really the big thing about it, they had essentially like magazines that they would load onto the gun. I think they carried 6 or 8 rounds. So they would load the magazine, they would fire, and then they would have to pull that magazine off and load another one on. Unlike the US ships where, like with the 40 millimeter Bofors, it was kind of a clip of 5 shells. They would load those in. As those went down, they would just drop another on top so they could just continually keep firing. So overall sustained rate of fire, a lot lower on these. However, there was a lot of them. 162 barrels, mostly in triple turrets like this. And again, a lot of them were enclosed like this. They had some open mount like this. Before this final mission, they had a bunch of them just open mount on the deck with sandbags around them. 4 13.2, about 50 caliber machine guns, not really much to speak of. So not the greatest complement of anti-aircraft guns, but a lot in general. So, and then armor, most armor of any ship ever built. So 16-inch inclined belt armor, super thick. I think the Iowa's 14-inch, 12-inch, I can't remember, but this is significantly thicker. 9 inches of horizontal armor for protection against bombs and plunging fire, plus a splinter shield deck below that. This actually did pretty well against US bombs. US bombs didn't really do a lot of significant damage to the main structure of this ship. It was primarily the torpedoes. It does have these torpedo bulges here. This was the ship's torpedo defense system. So these were essentially void spaces designed to absorb the shock of torpedoes before it got into the armored layer below. So, and like pretty much everybody, the whole ship wasn't armored. It was essentially an armored citadel around machinery spaces, the turrets, magazines, the more important vulnerable spots of the ship. And the thing that's a little unique on this ship, it was so wide, it's about 11 feet wider than the US battleships or this ship in its initial configuration. The Essex class carriers like this, same thing. They were designed to just barely squeak through the Panama Canal. Since the Japanese didn't need to worry about it, they made this ship significantly wider. That made it a very stable platform for gunfire, and it gave them a lot of internal space for their machinery. So unlike, say, on this ship or the US battleships, where the engine rooms are kind of staggered fore to aft, these essentially go all the way across port to starboard. 4 engine rooms, 4 engines driving 4 propellers, just kind of like this ship. Instead of 8 boilers, it had 12 boilers to run the power. Not as efficient machinery as the US Navy was producing. So even though this was more boilers, it only produced about the same amount of power as this ship, 150,000 horsepower, compared to like the U.S. Iowa class battleship that put out 212,000 horsepower. So as a result, this could do about 27 knots, which was fast, but not fast enough to keep up with the aircraft carriers. So it was kind of a challenge for this ship a little bit. And then you can see overall the displacement, Iowa class, the largest U.S. battleship, 57,000 tons full load. Yamato, 72,800 tons. So these were the largest ships up until essentially the first super carriers that the U.S. Navy built, the Forrestal class. Okay. By the way, if you guys have questions, fire away. I'll try and answer. So this ship went in service right like the week after Pearl Harbor, which was about 3 years before the first Iowa class battleships went in service. So it was really kind of ahead of the game. It was the flagship during the Midway campaign, although it was not with the aircraft carriers, it was with the invasion fleet that was going to be part of the landings on the island of Midway. So it didn't see any action during that. It did see some action at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This was really the only time the ship saw any significant action. It was part of the ships that broke through off the island of Samar in the Battle of Samar, attacked U.S. ships. One of the ships that was sunk, this USS Gambier Bay, primarily credited to the Yamato and her 18-inch guns. Only carrier to actually be sunk in combat by gunfire. But most of the war, the ship just kind of sat at places like Truk Lagoon. Didn't really do much. Yeah?
The only carrier in the Pacific to be sunk by gunfire, right?
Correct.
Only
Yeah.
American carrier sunk by gunfire.
Correct. Sorry. Yeah. So they actually built 3 of these ships. The first 2, the Yamato and her sister ship Musashi, were essentially identical, built as battleships. The third hull was called the Shinano. That was under construction at the time of Battle of Midway, and they decided to stop building it as a battleship and convert it into an aircraft carrier. So it was eventually built as an aircraft carrier. It got sunk by a U.S. torpedo, by a U.S. submarine, torpedoed by a U.S. submarine later in the war. So the majority of the war, Yamato and Musashi just kind of sat at anchor. The admirals would have their offices on them, and they were kind of jokingly called the Hotel Yamato, because it didn't do anything. It just sat around. So fast forward now to 1945, the U.S. has been moving across the Pacific. They've gone up the Solomons, across the Marshall Islands, sort of wrapping up the Philippines, and everybody knew, the Japanese as well as the U.S. pretty much knew that Okinawa was going to be the next target. It was the logical jumping off point for the invasion of the home islands, which was really going to be the next step. If you look at Japan here, Tokyo, southern part of Japan, Okinawa is down here, just a few hundred miles south of mainland Japan. So from here, just about any land-based aircraft could reach up to Japan, and it's a perfect jumping off point for the main invasion. So the Japanese pretty much knew this, and they had been planning to defend Okinawa for quite a while. Especially the land-based defenses had been going on for quite a while. But early in 45, I don't have the exact date, but there was a meeting, I think this was probably in March of 45. There was a meeting where the kind of heads of the armed forces had a meeting with the Emperor Hirohito, to give him a briefing on the defenses of Okinawa. What were they going to do to stop the Americans? Because they really wanted to make a big push to try and hold the Americans off there. So the Army generals, said, we got I forget what the number is, but large number of troops on the island. They've been preparing defenses for months and months. They're all prepared to fight to the death, to the last man, to fight the Americans off. The Army Air Service, the naval air commanders said, okay, well, we've prepared the largest concentration of aircraft. We're going to have massed kamikaze attacks like never seen before. Hundreds of kamikaze attacks that we're going to launch from southern Japan to attack the U.S. fleet. And those guys are all, again, prepared to give their life for the emperor to save Japan. So then he kind of said, well, so what about the surface fleet? What's your guys' plans? And Admiral Toyota here, who's the chief of staff, was kind of like, I'll get back to you on that. Because realistically, there was no plans. They really weren't planning anything because the odds were so ridiculously stacked in the favor of the U.S. that any surface ships trying to get down to Okinawa, they figured there's no chance they were going to make it. But he'd been called out. He figured we got to do something. This is going to look bad if we just let this ship, we have the most powerful battleship ever constructed. It's going to look bad if we just let it get bombed by B-29s or whatever while it's sitting in harbor. So we got to come up with some kind of a plan. So the plan was they would take the Yamato, last one of these ships left. They would scrounge together whatever other surface escort ships they could get, which turned out to be 1 light cruiser and 8 destroyers. They would leave in the afternoon from up here in southern Japan, steam at high speed, hug the coast. They'd go through the Bungo Strait here, hug the coast. They would head almost direct west, and then they would come straight south. And they figured they would miss some of the U.S. patrolling aircraft and ships by sort of coming in from the north. And then the plan was at early morning, they would show up off the invasion beaches. They would go in blasting with all their guns through all the U.S. ships. They'd blow up all the U.S. transport ships. And then eventually they would beach the ship on Okinawa near the invasion beaches. The guns on the seaside would be blasting U.S. ships. The guns on the land side would be blasting the U.S. soldiers on the beaches. And then eventually, once they ran out of ammo, everybody would jump off the ship, and they gave them extra rifles, machine guns, and they would join the soldiers that were defending the island. So sounds like a good plan, right? Well, so one battleship, 1 light cruiser, 8 destroyers. U.S. Navy, 39 aircraft carriers, 11 fleet aircraft carriers, so 10 Essex class like this, plus the Enterprise, 6 light carriers, 22 escort carriers, 18 battleships, 27 cruisers, 177 destroyers or destroyer escorts. If you count all the troop ships, landing craft, it was something like 1,300 vessels the U.S. Navy had. That's not to count the Royal Navy. They had, I think, 3 aircraft carriers, a couple battleships and stuff too. These ships were kind of split, right? A lot of them were dealing with the invasion, right? These 22 escort carriers, mainly their planes were providing ground support. A number of the battleships were providing gunfire support to the troops, but still, incredible, just an incredible force. In fact, the Captain Hara, who's the captain of the Yahagi, he said after the war that this was like throwing an egg against a rock. It's just completely ridiculous. So the guy that was selected to lead this mission was this guy, Admiral Ito. He had actually been the chief of staff, Toyota's job, earlier, but in 1944 he'd kind of been talking like, well, I don't know if this war is winnable for us, which was kind of a bad career move. So he got replaced. So he got told, okay, here's your mission. You're going to go do this. And he was like, hell no, this is completely stupid. We're not doing it. So Toyota tapped this guy, Admiral Kusaka. He was on his staff. He was kind of chosen because he'd been a classmate at the Naval Academy with Ito. They'd been good friends for years. So he said, okay, Kusaka, go down there, kind of give him the come to Jesus speech and convince them that this is what you guys need to do. So he goes down there. They have a meeting with Ito as well as all the captains of all 10 of the ships. Doesn't really go very well. It's kind of about the closest you get to a mutiny in the Japanese Navy. I have a couple quotes I want to read. First of all, I want to read you this. This is the message that Kusaka brought down from Admiral Toyota to read to these guys. He says, "This task force of the Imperial Navy, in cooperation with the Army, is about to stake its entire air, sea, and land might in an all-out attack against enemy ships in the vicinity of Okinawa. The fate of the Empire hangs in the balance. For this occasion, we have organized a naval special attack force and have given it orders for an attack unparalleled in its heroic bravery. We've done this to exalt the glorious tradition of the might of the Imperial Navy, gathering together the might of the Imperial Navy for this one battle and to transmit its glory to posterity." After when he read that, one of the destroyer captains said, if he thinks this is the ultimate glory, then why doesn't he come out from his bunker near Tokyo and come down here and lead this mission himself? So they went kind of around and round. Kusaka, one of the big things he was telling them, which is true, is that this mission really wasn't going to be in a vacuum. They were going to coordinate this with these large kamikaze attacks. So a little bit of a synergistic effect. Number one, the kamikaze attacks were hopefully going to damage U.S. carriers and tie up U.S. aircraft so they wouldn't be able to attack these Japanese ships. And then also, any U.S. ships that went to attack this task force wouldn't be available to fight off the kamikazes. So he kind of pressed that, and then also he just said, hey, it is what it is. These are your orders, and they're not changing it. So mission was set to, they were going to leave on April 6th. So April 5th, actually a little before, they went down, fueled the ships. The kind of common thing you hear is that has traditionally been said is they only had enough fuel for a one-way mission. Yamato was an incredible fuel hog, and Japan was incredibly short of fuel at this time. Sounds like some newer research, the base commander where they left from just said, hey, I'm giving you every last drop we got in the base. So it turned out they actually had quite a bit of fuel, enough to get down and back if they needed to. So there had been a group of about 50 naval cadets that had just come on the ship. They had just come from the academy. They were brand new. They didn't really know anything. They weren't going to be any help, so they booted those guys off. Some guys that were sick or injured, they took them off the ship. They offered anybody that was on the ship that didn't want to go on the mission could get off. Nobody did. They all stayed. So that night of the 5th, basically the captain said, we're not coming back. Open up the doors to all the supply closets. So sake, cigarettes, candy, whatever you want, take it. They had kind of a big party on that night of the 5th. A lot of singing, a lot of drinking, a lot of guys writing letters home, reminiscing. Woke up the next morning on the 6th, and they started to prepare to head out on this mission. So started doing damage control, anti-aircraft drills. All the ships got themselves all prepped. also on the 6th was the first of these large kamikaze attacks. They called these the Kikasui raids. This was Kikasui 1, the first one. So 524 total Japanese aircraft in this raid, 297 kamikaze, so almost 300 kamikaze attacks. Did some pretty significant damage. They were mainly hitting the ships on the periphery of the U.S. fleet, trying to knock out a lot of the radar picket ships. So 3 destroyers were sunk, amphibious warfare ship, a couple munition ships, and a number of other ships were damaged as well. So big strike. A lot of the U.S. aircraft were involved trying to repel those. Later in the day, 1600, the force set sails. One thing I didn't mention, the U.S. commanders knew about this mission days before. You know, the U.S. code breaking had gotten pretty advanced towards that part of the war. So they actually knew the basics of this plan before the Japanese captains that were leaving on it did. Like most crypto stuff, they didn't have specifics, but they basically knew there was going to be a surface fleet coming down. It was going to center around the Yamato, and it was going to be attacking the invasion beaches. So they essentially knew it was coming and basically when it was coming. Hour and a half after these guys leave port, they're already sighted by a U.S. submarine. They had a couple U.S. submarines in that Bungo Strait waiting to see if these ships came out, sighted it right away. The ships were moving at over 20 knots and they were zigzagging, so couldn't get a torpedo solution to fire at these ships, but they were able to give a sighting report. They sent it out in the clear over the radio, so the Japanese knew, they already knew they were busted. They were already they had already been sighted, so their chance of surprise was going to be pretty minimal. So, U.S. started preparing for what are we going to do for this to fight off this force of ships, and they kind of had to balance, right? We might have another raid of hundreds of kamikazes, so we can't just throw everything at this. We have to sort of have a balanced approach. So there was some discussion. Do we take some of these old battleships that are doing shore bombardment, send them out to counter these ships? They didn't really want to send the fast battleships, the newer ones, because they could keep up with the aircraft carriers and they were key in the anti-aircraft defenses. But they figured they could spare some of these older ships. Some of these were some of the ships that had been sunk at Pearl Harbor, refloated. Definitely way inferior to the Yamato, but if they had 8 or 10 of them, you know, they obviously were going to come out ahead of this. The other option was, do we send aircraft, right? U.S. Task Force 58, which was the striking force, had over 1,000 aircraft. Much more efficient way to do this, right? If we're sending a bunch of battleships out to counter this, probably a lot more ships are going to get damaged and probably a lot more Americans are going to get killed compared to attacking the ship with aircraft. But on the other hand, they kind of need the aircraft to defend against kamikazes, at least the fighters. So they eventually decide we're going to use the carriers. They take 8 of these ships and they kind of get them prepped as essentially to be the backstop. If somehow these ships get past the aircraft, they're going to be kind of the last line of defense. They never actually deploy them because they didn't have to, but they were ready. So early on April 7th, ships are coming down. First thing in the morning, 6:30, a Hellcat from Essex that was out scouting sights the Yamato and its escort ships, transmits the location, again in the clear. Over time, a couple other Hellcats, some Martin Mariners show up, and they just start circling around these ships just out of range. At one point, they actually fired the 16-inch guns at one of these Martin Mariners, and it ducked back into the clouds and it was not hit. But they just circled out of range. Had to be, you know, really frustrating and scary for these guys on the ships. So there was no air support, air cover in the works for this plan. A few Japanese Zeros showed up in the morning, but it was very kind of cloudy, overcast conditions. They never ran into the U.S. aircraft, so they showed up for a little while and then they left really without doing anything. Ships were back on their own. It was also being trailed by this submarine, the Hackleback. The ships had kind of like zigzagged a little bit during the night, so it was kind of able to keep up with them. Again, not able to get a firing solution, but tracking them all the way. So, 10 a.m., the first wave of aircraft launch. So, Bennington, Hornet, Bellawood, San Jacinto were kind of the first ships to leave to launch the attack. So, from this ship here, the Hornet, they basically sent the whole air wing of bombers. So all 15 of the Curtiss Helldiver dive bombers, 14 out of the 15 Grumman Avengers. I'm guessing the 15th was probably down with mechanical problems. So with these, basically the Avenger is a torpedo bomber. It's designed to come in at pretty low altitude, drop a Mark 13 torpedo in the water, which will then time to hit the ship. The Helldiver is a dive bomber, so it's ideally designed to come in at about 10,000 feet, go into a near vertical dive. It had dive brakes that would open to kind of slow its descent, and then by coming straight down and dropping its bomb, it was able to be much more accurate than trying to just bomb from level flight or at an angle. And then they sent the majority of the ships on the U.S., or the majority of aircraft on U.S. carriers at this point were fighters. Hornet had 71 Hellcat fighters. They sent 16 because they wanted to keep the rest of them in reserve for kamikaze attacks. Plus, not as effective against a ship like the Yamato as the bombers were. So they sent 16 of them. Between all these carriers, they sent 280 aircraft. The Hancocks all got lost somehow. The weather was really bad, so that brought it down to 227 that eventually got to the Japanese. So the first aircraft to make it there were from Bunker Hill and San Jacinto. I forgot to mention, of the 8 destroyers, early in the morning, this ship, the Asashimo, developed engine trouble. So it was still able to keep going forward, but it couldn't keep up with the rest of the ship, so it started to drop behind. So the planes from Bunker Hill and San Jacinto, they happened to see this first, and they just swarmed on it. Probably not the most efficient, but they hit it with multiple bombs and torpedoes, sunk with all hands. No crew members were ever found from this ship. So that was really the first casualty. Then as the rest of the ships got there, originally a Marine officer from the Bennington, I think, was supposed to be in charge of this whole strike group. He was flying a Corsair. It had engine trouble, so he had to come back. So this guy, Ed Conrad, ended up being the strike group leader. He was from the Hornet. He was what's called the CAG, the commander of the air group. So he's the guy in charge of the whole air wing on the Hornet. And he was put in charge of all this aircraft. So usually these pilots are excited to get in there. A lot of times, as you see most of these naval battles, planes show up, as soon as they see an enemy ship, they're diving on it. But he kind of like called the timeout again on everybody. He got all the planes to just stop, circle out of range, and for about 15 to 20 minutes, he just sat there and he said, "You guys, are doing this, you guys are attacking this, you guys are attacking this. Came up with a whole plan. And really this first wave, it was largely designed, a lot of their goal was to degrade the Yamato's ability to defend itself, so later aircraft that could come in could really deliver the more serious blows on it. So got everybody squared away. He actually won the silver or the gold star for his performance on this, because he really made this much more efficient. So it says, when the air coordinator for task group was forced to return to base, Commander Conrad assumed command, and despite adverse weather conditions, which compelled him to circle the target area at low altitude in range of intense anti-aircraft fire, directed a series of successful attacks in which numerous torpedo and bomb hits were scored on a battleship, cruiser, and 4 destroyers, all of which eventually sank. His leadership, courage, and devotion to duty upheld the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. So, a little history from this ship. So, when he eventually sent the guys in, this first group, compared to later waves, had by far the toughest job. Most obviously, all these ships, minus the Asashimo, were intact, anti-aircraft guns ready to go, fully staffed. They were moving together as a solid group at speed. Yamato had gone up to its top speed of 27 knots. Escorting ships were around it. So much more challenging and much more dangerous in terms of the anti-aircraft defenses. The other big thing is the weather was really poor during this initial attack. Later on it would improve a little bit, but in this it was about 3,000 feet was the ceiling. So especially for the dive bombers, they couldn't really come in at the altitude they would like and dive. So instead of doing really true diving attacks, they had to come in at a little bit of an angle and drop their bombs that way, which was not as effective. So 1237, the first attacks began on the Yamato. Started with the fighter aircraft coming in, strafing the decks. Some of the fighters had rockets, some of them had smaller high explosive bombs. Really, none of that was going to do any damage to the ship significantly, but it was horrible for all the anti-aircraft gunners. They killed a huge amount of the gun crews, which made it easier for the ships or the aircraft that came after them. So the Helldivers from the Hornet and Bennington came in. You can see from this photo, this was actually taken by one of the Hornet pilots. These wakes, these guys were just, you can see the Yamatos here. It goes like this, and like this. For as big of a ship, it was actually pretty maneuverable. And the U.S. kind of tactic was to group all the ships together, be stable, and use the anti-aircraft gun fire to really ward off attacks. Japanese, they relied a lot more on maneuvering. So they would watch planes come in. As they started their bomb run or their torpedo run, they would just start maneuvering the ship like crazy. Especially when torpedoes were in the water, they would maneuver to try and miss the torpedoes. So of all these bombers, a bunch of near-miss hits, and I'll say, when we start to look at a specific battle, I don't know what I'm saying is accurate. There's a whole bunch of sources out there that say a whole bunch of different things. I'm trying to give you what I think is probably most accurate from more current sources, but I may be wrong. And like I said, if you look at different books, it'll say a whole bunch of different things. But they got at least 2 direct bomb hits on the Yamato. The first one was in the crew's quarters. Really nobody there, really didn't do, it was in a berthing area, so it really didn't do anything significant to the ship. However, the other bomb hit, which was probably done by one of the Helldivers from the Hornet, it's not really confirmed, but probably from the Hornet, landed kind of right back here near the aft air search radar, knocked out the aft air search radar, knocked out the secondary battery gun director, a number of these anti-aircraft positions, and it penetrated down into the ready reserve area for this secondary 8-inch turret. And it started a huge fire, ended up killing pretty much all the crew of that. You can kind of see here this smoke coming out. And if you look at pictures from here till the end of this battle, you'll see smoke continuously coming out of that area. Started a big fire. Those ready reserve rounds kept cooking off. Started a big fire that stayed. At least one Helldiver was shot down during this attack. I'm not sure if it was from Hornet or Bennington. I couldn't find that out, but at least one Helldiver was shot down. So then, just after that, the Hornet's Avengers came in with torpedoes. So again, they had Corsairs from the Bunker Hill strafing the anti-aircraft gunners as the Hornet's torpedo bombers came in from the port side. Again, depending on different sources, sounds like, you know, if you look at that battle board, it says 4 torpedo hits. Well, it's probably 1. You look at this, this is probably a near-miss bomb hit. Looks a lot like a torpedo. This picture actually was from this book here. This is essentially the cruise book for the Hornet from 1944, 1945. So this was taken from one of the Hornet's aircraft. And this is almost certainly that hit, torpedo hit on the port side of the Yamato. Took on 2,235 tons of water. That was per Japanese witness who was up on the bridge. They had to counter flood to keep the ship on an even keel, so they ended up taking on more water. Really not much very significant in terms of damage to the ship. The ship kept going at high speed, really didn't slow down, but it essentially started the ball rolling. The U.S. the U.S. pilots had decided wherever they get a hit on one side of the ship, they were going to try and fire all their torpedoes into that same side. So hit on the port side. After that, basically just about all the torpedo bombers attacked from the port side with the goal of causing the ship to capsize. Yeah.
This was actually learned after they sunk Musashi during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It's because she took around like 19 torpedo hits on both sides to bring her down. So. Yeah. During Battle of Leyte Gulf, her sister ship Musashi, they attacked from both sides. So essentially, they were counter flooding the ship for the Japanese. In this case, if all the hits are on one side, the Japanese would have to counter flood on the other side to keep the ship from capsizing. And eventually, they kind of couldn't do that anymore. So Musashi essentially just like went even keel underwater eventually. So during this attack, one of the VT-17 Avengers from the Hornet was shot down. These guys, Lee O'Brien, Jacob Rickerson, James Opine, were killed. With torpedo bomber, if they're hit low altitude, not a lot of ability to get out. And actually, I have another quote here. This is from one of the VT-17 Avengers from Hornet. This is one of the pilots. He said, one aircraft radio that he'd seen a blip on his radar screen off to starboard about 50 miles out. So we turned right, then we saw them. Holy mackerel, Yamato looked like the Empire State Building plowing through the water. We didn't have too much ceiling. I was at 12,000 feet at the most, and I usually like to start at 18,000 feet for a torpedo run. Steep approach, then tight over the water to drop a torpedo before getting the hell out of there. Meanwhile, the bombers were supposed to be going down, so we all hit the ship simultaneously.
We spread out, and I kept diving towards different puffs of smoke where the shells had exploded. There shouldn't have been any damage there. I went down, dropped my torpedo, and went right across the bow of Yamato. Ship was turning, but our attack, the ship was turning, but in our attack, we always dropped in a fan shape, so no matter which way a ship was turning, it was going to get hit. And then I have another quote from the bridge of the Yamato. There's a guy that survived. He was a ensign on the ship, a radar officer. He ended up writing a book after, which is actually a very interesting book. So he wrote, "The tracks of the torpedoes are a beautiful white against the water, as if someone were drawing a needle through the water. They come pressing in, aimed at Yamato from a dozen different directions and intersecting silently. Estimating by sight their distance and angle on the plotting board, we shift course to run parallel to the torpedoes and barely succeed in dodging them. A very skillful attack. To judge by their dexterity in dodging our anti-aircraft fire and the fearlessness in taking aim, these must be the elite of the American forces." So, as I mentioned, a lot of this first attack was designed to degrade the anti-aircraft potential. So a lot of the aircraft were diverted towards the other escorts. So the light cruiser Yahagi was the primary escort ship. It dodged a number of torpedoes, but 1246, it took a torpedo right in the engine room, flooded the engine room, and it was dead in the water. So it was out of the fight. It would later in the day get hit by multiple bombs and torpedoes and sunk. This destroyer Hamikaze was hit by a torpedo and sunk. And then this Isokaze, when the Yahagi was hit, it was told to come over here to try and assist. There was an admiral that was in charge of the escorting ships. They were coming over to try and take the admiral off. And as they slowed down, U.S. planes pounced on it. It was hit by multiple bombs, and it later sank as well. And then Suzuki had its bow blown off by a bomb. It actually ended up steaming in reverse all the way back to Japan and made it back, but it was never going to be seen again, used again. So 1250, the first wave is departs. So that's kind of for the Hornet's crew, that was sort of the end of this mission for them, not for the Japanese. So 1222, aircraft from the Essex and Baton, 50 aircraft come in. They were in the first launch with the other aircraft, but they had got a later start, so they came in a little bit later. Attack concentrated basically all on Yamato. Several bomb hits, no torpedo hits, but several bomb hits in the area of the bridge. Again, more anti-aircraft damage, damage to the anti-aircraft gunners and the ship's defenses. And a number of Helldivers were damaged during that attack, but they ended up, none of the aircraft were shot down. So the third wave, basically, they poured on everything from the Yamato. And this was 110 aircraft from Yorktown, Intrepid, and Langley. So at this point, the Yamato was still traveling pretty close to 27 knots. It was still maneuvering, but its anti-aircraft fire was pretty minimal. They came in and they got 3 torpedo hits again on the port side, kind of in the engineering spaces, kind of all along here. Didn't actually penetrate into the engineering spaces per most sources, but it got to where they couldn't counterflood enough to keep the ship on an even keel. So I don't know if this is correct, but most of the things I read say that the damage control, I mentioned the engine rooms are essentially 4 across, and there was a big wall in between those rooms. They flooded the engineering spaces on the starboard side. I don't know if damage control has the ability to flood an engine room, but that's what the sources mainly say. A lot of the guys were trapped down there in the engine rooms, never got out. Got the ship back to essentially an even keel, and then it was just pouring on, right? So, and with that, when they flooded the engineering spaces, the ship dropped to 10 knots. So now it's pretty much a sitting duck. 2 more torpedoes, 4 bombs, 4 more bomb hits, and then at least 5 more torpedo hits. Almost all on the port side. As it started to list more and more, a couple Avengers came in from the starboard side, dropped torpedoes, which essentially hit the bottom of the ship. So it started rolling more and more. Little after 1400, Admiral Ito sends out word to all the other ships as well as back to Japan that the mission is canceled. It's unsuccessful. He goes back to his cabin, closes the door. He's never seen again. Goes down with the ship. So Captain Aruga, he orders abandoned ship. At that point, the ship going over and over more to where it was almost vertical or horizontal. And I'll have another quote from this about his kind of last moments. So it says, in the anti-aircraft command post on the very top of the bridge, still wearing his helmet and flak jacket, he binds himself to the binnacle, which is the compass post, ties himself to the compass post. Having completed the final dispositions, the code books, the command for all hands to come on deck, he shouts "Banzai" 3 times. On finishing, he turns to look at the 4 surviving lookouts standing by his side. They are too devoted to this resolute captain to be able to leave. Seeing their resolve to die together crystallizing amongst them, he slaps each on the shoulder, encourages them to keep their spirits up, and pushes them into the water. The final sailor presses his last 4 biscuits into the captain's hands, as if to show his innermost feelings. The captain takes him with a grin. As he has the second one in his mouth, he's engulfed along with the ship. He said, "To eat biscuits at such a time, iron nerves without equal." Thus are the words of the chief lookout. He too was unable to leave the captain's side. In the end, he was thrown into the water while standing right next to the captain, but not having lashed himself down, he floated to the surface. He was one of the survivors. So the ship is going over more and more. And then...
Question about the last picture.
Yeah.
Do you know the source of that?
Yeah. This is insane. Yeah. This is actually a CGI from... There was a movie that came out in 2005. I actually just ordered it on DVD. I haven't watched it. It was called Men of Yamato. It was a Japanese film. Followed a number of anti-aircraft gunners who came on the ship. It's supposed to be a good movie. You guys seen it? Yeah. I've watched this last battle scene. It's on YouTube. You could look it up. But this is CGI from that. And I'll show you a picture later. They built an incredible set of the ship. So as the ship is starting to go under, the forward powder magazines detonate. And shortly after, the aft powder magazines detonate. So you can imagine all that powder to fire those shells. 842,000 pounds of powder goes off, minus whatever they'd fired in the main guns, which is probably not a lot. So it made a mushroom cloud that went up to 18,000 feet and could be seen for over 100 miles away. And there was a number of U.S. aircraft that were circling that actually got knocked out of the sky from the force of this explosion. I read some source saying that more U.S. aircraft were knocked down by this explosion than by anti-aircraft fire. I don't know if that's true, but it makes a good story. But a couple of these pictures, you can actually see a huge shock wave heading out from this. So And when this happened, they were still 300 miles from the invasion beaches. So really no chance of this being at all a success. So in the end, out of Yamato's crew of 3,332, only 23 officers and 246 enlisted sailors survived. And in total of the Japanese task force, 242 Japanese sailors died. 6 out of the 10 ships were sunk, 2 others heavily damaged. In one of the most lopsided battles, probably in the history of warfare, U.S. lost 12 aircrew and 10 aircraft in exchange for 4,242. So incredibly one-sided. So a little bit of this. The Yamato has since probably become, I don't know, maybe the most famous ship in Japan. It's almost cult-like status. It's kind of really revered by the Japanese. And yeah, so it was very a big deal at the time, and it's still a big deal even today. So they found the wreck at about 1,100 feet in 1985. You can see this is a model of what the wreck looks like, completely obliterated. You can see the forward powder magazine basically blew the ship in half, and then the aft powder magazine blew the side out. But the bow section is sitting almost straight up. This is the bow, picture of the bow of the wreck. It's the Imperial chrysanthemum on the bow, covered in gold leaf. I think it was something like 6 feet across. So in Kure, near the Kure Naval Shipyard, there's a museum today. It's called the Kure Shipyard Museum, I think, Kure Naval Base Museum, but everybody calls it the Yamato Museum because that's really the focus of it. This is kind of the centerpiece. It's a 1/10 scale model of the ship, gigantic, a lot bigger than this thing. And then they also have a number of artifacts that have been brought up from the wreck, plus a number of other things, pieces from other battleships, guns and other things from other battleships that survived. So that's a very popular museum today in Japan. I mentioned that movie. This is the set that was built for that movie, Men of Yamato. After they filmed the movie, they kept this set open for about a year before they took it apart, and they let people go on it. Had over 1 million visitors during the year that it was open. And then now, actually in like a mall that's almost right across from the Yamato Museum, they've saved a number of the pieces from it. I don't know if they have the main gun turret, but they have like secondary gun turrets and some of these 25 millimeter turrets. So they have a number of pieces and people go to see that. So last things I just want to leave you guys with while you're here on the Hornet. I always feel that if I hear about history and I'm able to go somewhere where that history took place, it's really moving and it makes it more important, a more important experience. So some places on this ship, since this ship had a significant part in this story, some places you can go to on this ship. So number one, just back here on this deck, the torpedo workshop and torpedo storage. You can look down here, see the Mark 13 torpedoes stored down there. We have a number of Mark 13 torpedoes. Think about those guys pulling the torpedoes up, pulling the warheads up from the warhead magazine, putting them together, fueling them, loading them on the aircraft. The space is, from what I understand, pretty much looks the same as it did back then. They modified it a little bit later date, but it looks basically just like those guys were pulling torpedoes up for this mission. Even closer down here on this deck, the pilot ready room. So I encourage you guys, go check it out. Maybe sit in these seats for a little bit. Think about these guys getting a briefing to go attack this ship. Must have been pretty sobering to go attack the largest warship ever built. And then up on deck, right, we're fortunate to have a TBM Avenger. It's painted in the same scheme of the VT-17 aircraft that took part in this mission. It's got a Mark 13 torpedo right under its weapons bay. So again, think about those guys coming in, low altitude, right into the face of whatever that was, 300 and something anti-aircraft gun barrels, boring in, dropping their torpedoes. And also think about that Captain Conrad, like coming up with this whole plan while he's up there in the air, distributing everybody out efficiently. And then the last thing, I think about this painting a lot. This was later on during the Okinawa campaign, during some of the other kamikaze missions. This ship was very fortunate. It was never hit by a bomb, torpedo, or kamikaze, but it had a lot of close calls. The often quoted thing is that it was attacked 59 times. During this Okinawa campaign, there was actually a guy named Dwight Shepler. He was a Navy combat artist, just kind of like they have combat photographers. This guy was an artist. He was on the ship and he was doing paintings. He witnessed this. This Japanese Zero was hit by anti-aircraft gunfire, just barely went over the deck where a bunch of planes were getting ready to take off and into the water. So very narrow miss. So when I'm up on the flight deck and I'm looking and I'm kind of forward by the catapults, sometimes I look back at the island and I think about this painting, even though the island looks a little different now. That's where it happened. And then the last thing, back in the chapel, we have a big board that lists all the crewmen of the Hornet that were killed. And I don't know about all these guys, but like I said, this guy, Opheim, Rickardson, Warren, these three guys were killed during that mission. So it's important to remember those guys' sacrifices. So that's what I got. Happy to answer any questions. Happy to take you guys somewhere on the ship if you want to go see. Can't guarantee I got answers. Thank you.